Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Laura Mayer. Laura, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks for having me. My name's Laura Mayer. I'm a longtime, get ready for it, podcast executive. That is a thing. And I am currently the host of a show that I'm producing and hosting myself independently called Shameless Acquisition Target. The subtitle is The Show That Sells Itself, because the gimmick of the show is I'm trying to sell it for parts at the end of its run, which is upcoming. And so you're talking to me in the middle of my period where I'm just truly shamelessly selling myself as hard as I possibly can.
Well, thank you for coming on, and hopefully this will help with the promotion, at least somewhat.
I'm
Um,
sure it will.
so the Shameless Acquisition Target is the name of the podcast, and you can find that using whatever podcast app you
hmm
use, or you can go to shameless.biz, B-I-Z. That's a
hmm
great URL.
It will not give you viruses, despite the URL and the look of the website. I'm very proud of the website.
Okay, so I was actually describing this show to someone, and I think it's a little hard to describe what it is, although you gave a brief description already. The show is about the podcast industry in a lot of ways, but it
hmm
also is sort of biographical. It's funny. It's postmodern in various ways because it's a podcast about itself.
hmm
And you literally are trying to sell as much as you can of it at the end.
hmm
Okay, so how, what's your elevator pitch, to use that cliche term,
Yeah.
of what the show
Of
is?
which I've been doing a lot of lately. So you can probably, this will be a spoiler as to how successful or not I am at the end of this whole thing. Shameless Acquisition Target, subtitled The Show That Sells Itself, is, I think you did a great job describing it. I mean, it's a limited run series for now, question mark. And it's about the growth of an industry that certainly when I started technically working in it or alongside it in 2009 is much different than what it is today. However, many years later, that is, I can't do the math or else I will have an existential crisis. And it's really about how, for me, what happens from my perspective, uh, or what has happened from my perspective, as I've seen, I'd say, a podcast, an industry go from like teenagehooddom, adolescence, to adulthood, like very quickly, as helped by billions of dollars being injected into it over the course of just a few years. And it's funny because when I started in podcasting, it was so associated with public radio. And I started my first like paid radio job was in public radio. And when I started at WNYC in 2009, they were shutting down a lot of their podcasts. And since then, obviously podcasting has become its own thing, which is great. There's a lot more diversity of shows, of types of shows, of formats, of hosts, of everything. But I think that there's also another thing that this series does, or I hope it does, is kind of track some, I think, key mistakes that were made along the way of the many millions / billions of dollars that were injected into an industry that wasn't maybe quite ready for it, in which lessons from film and TV, and especially streaming, a nascent medium in itself, streaming film and TV, or TV and film to a certain extent, were directly ported onto podcasting. And I think that led to a lot of business and creative decisions to be made that I saw being made in a lot of different boardrooms or meetings throughout the years that were just sort of wacky. And I'm trying to portray that sort of wackiness that I've seen over the last few years in this series.
Okay, so you were there early on,
hmm
and you also were a super fan of public radio and
Yes.
This American Life in particular, which I mean set some of the aesthetic tone for a lot of podcasts,
hmm
and also gave birth to Serial, which was
hmm
one of the, I don't know, most successful podcasts ever, and also really changed
Totally.
or supercharged the industry. So part of, the title is Shameless Acquisition Target, and part of what you're doing is saying like you have worked behind the scenes at a lot of different companies and podcasts that our viewers or they're not viewers, our listeners have heard of, and you can mention them if you want to. And you have seen fortunes rise and fall, and
Hmm.
people who you are working with become superstars,
Hmm.
and you are often, you know, a behind the scenes person
Hmm.
who did not did not become a superstar yet, at least.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
The ship has not come in,
right.
literally. First
It's
thing I'll do is buy a boat. I'm just kidding.
and so part of the show is like, and I think this is somewhat tongue in cheek, but you can clarify, is like time to get mine. Like I need
Yep.
to, like, you're shameless about it. Like you want to make some money off of this
Yeah.
crazy podcasting thing because you've seen people make ridiculous amounts of money over the past 5 or so years. And so part of that is like the acquisition model. Can you talk
Hmm.
about that and how that has shaped or deformed, what was originally what good about podcasts?
Sure. I mean, it's interesting because I've seen from the inside at a bunch of different companies that I've worked at, like various value calculators, where it's like someone comes in with an idea and then it goes through a process that I'm sure is the case in different ways for all media, which is like, okay, this is creative art that we think could have an audience. Let's determine what that audience could look like via this proprietary formula. And then let's determine how much money we should or could get away with giving that person, or how little money we could or should get away with giving that person. And truly, like, I've been on the buyer side of things, and if not, I've not necessarily run those calculators, but I've certainly been the one to be like, this is what our budget is. I have seen art meet commerce directly, um, so to speak. And it's interesting because with all the money that came in, like I remember the day Gimlet was bought is one that like really sticks out to me as a turning point. There is, of course, there are kind of two major turning points to me from like a commercial and like art-ish perspective. One is the day that the last episode of Serial aired. And that being just like a huge deal at WNYC where I worked at the time. And there were listening parties in the event space at WNYC. And there was just a lot of like, you know, it really felt like a time of possibility and of it really being like, oh, WNYC, at least for producers in New York, isn't necessarily this only game in town. And when I moved to New York in 2009, like permanently, I was just trying to get a job at WNYC because that was the only place that I felt like I could work in public radio and actually like be hired to do that. But then suddenly Serial happens at the same time or around the same time that Gimlet launches. And suddenly all of my friends at the public radio station, or largely a lot of my friends at the public radio station, are leaving, which was, I remember at the time, like someone saying like to me, like I was asking like, well, why are you sending all these like thank you notes to all these like high up execs you've never met? And they said to me, well, you never know like when we're going to have to come back here. Like, I think that this idea of, oh, this whole Gimlet thing probably won't work, or this podcast business probably won't work. So like, we still got to keep our options open in case we need to come back with our tails between our legs.
Mhm.
And but meantime, I'm there. I'm like amped that there's this podcast that like has theme music by like one of my favorite musicians of all time. That's like, I've been a true crime obsessive since I was a kid. Like I remember reading Helter Skelter like while I was babysitting at some point. Like I was just like, what is going on? I am here. Something is arriving. And then sure enough, when Gimlet started, then a bunch of other podcasts startups started. I left to join one in large part because I wanted better dental insurance. And it really felt like, oh, this is a new way of doing business. And of course, when you're like 24, 25, 26, you have no sense of perspective, or I had no perspective. Let me back up. At that age, I had no sense of perspective in terms of, in the industry and the media industry, especially. There's sort of like this wave of new hot things that kind of ebb and flow. And so it really, so there wasn't a sense to me like, oh, it could go away. I really was like all in from the beginning. Like, this is the new way of doing things.
Mhm.
And it was exciting. And from a material perspective, it was the first time I was being paid a livable wage. And I was able to like feed my cat the slightly better food and go to the dentist. So that is time one.
And we should
And
just say for people who
Mhm.
maybe have heard of Gimlet, but don't know the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
backstory, we don't need to get fully into it. But Gimlet was, and correct me on anything I have wrong here. Gimlet
Mhm.
was founded by Alex Bloomberg, who came from This American Life, and
And Planet
became
Money.
right, and which are obviously both very successful. Was Planet Money originally a radio show, or was it always a podcast? I think
I
it would just air on NPR, also, I believe,
Yeah,
right?
I'm not sure. I think it was a spin-off. Hard to
That
tell. I'm not sure.
Yeah, okay, but it
That's
moves.
a controversial question, I think.
Okay, so but moving from public radio and then started this podcast company, and then you had a show which I've actually never listened to called Startup. That was
Mhm.
a podcast about starting a podcast
Mhm.
company, which you talk about this on your show, which
Mhm.
is, I mean, some way a sort of like postmodern version of
Yeah.
Startup, I assume, but like Startup was turned into a sitcom
Mhm.
starring Zach Braff,
Mhm.
which only aired for one season. But you talk about how like unlikely that is to begin with, and sort of insane
Yeah,
that
yeah,
that
yeah.
happened. So like Gimlet is, there's a lot of parallels between like the podcast industry and sort of like the app startup tech
Mhm.
industry, various ways. So
Mhm.
Gimlet, would be like, it's not a Facebook exactly, but super successful, about as
Totally.
successful as it could be for what it was.
Totally. And it was a big time first mover in the space in terms of, um, I mean, the startup in the podcast about creating the podcast startup was a lot about in the first season, especially about raising venture capital. And that had not been done, at least not to the scale that they did it in podcasting. And so it was, and then it was a personal story. It was about Alex Bloomberg leaving basically the best job that you could have in podcasting at the time, between Planet Money and This American Life, to take a big financial risk to do something that, he's as a business reporter, had reported on, but had never done himself, to start this new thing that hadn't existed before. And that added to some of the excitement. And my show, which I think you mentioned, like, obviously it is not the no one's going to be talking about my show like 8 years from now in a podcast interview about, like, there's this sense of excitement and possibility and blah blah blah. Like, I'm essentially creating bullshit startup, which is what one of my friends called it. And I
Uh-huh.
was like, oh, that's me. And I was like, oh no, that's right. Like, that's exactly right. Like, that show too came out around the time of Serial and added to this like full blown moment of real like economic possibility and wonder in the medium, that I had. And this gets, I guess, to the second inflection point from my perspective is, Gimlet was hugely splashy. They made some really good work. Their founders were really at the center of the story because of their podcast, and then also because Alex Bloomberg was involved in making like all of their shows, and I think to a certain extent is still really involved in making all of their shows. They made this bet that was a really risky one, that they were going to spend a lot of money on all of their shows with the intent of all of their shows becoming film and TV projects. After they kind of didn't expect that to happen, when it did happen with Startup, which was became Alex Inc., which was the the television, fictional television version of the podcast Startup, starring Zach Braff. This is very confusing to everyone. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
for this,
it's sort of, like Ouroboros, did anyone do a podcast about that show, like a weekly recap podcast of that show? Like that would
No,
have
but they
been
would now.
an
And I guess
additional
some could
layer.
say that I did that one episode, could be spun out as just like a really loving love letter to Alex Inc. Which my like aunt-in-law recently told me. She was like, I love that show. I hated that it got canceled. And I was like,
Nice. Somehow
nice.
I missed this entirely. I know I had never heard of it before, despite being, at least adjacent to the podcast
Yeah.
industry for.
Well, no, I'd say you're in. You have a podcast. You're in there with us.
Right. Okay. True. But and somehow, and actually, I've always sort of kept half an eye on Zach Braff because we went to the same high school. Although he
really? I went to the same college as Zach Braff.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah, Columbia High School in Maplewood, New Jersey. And it does sort of seem like a weird time capsule of an era that like. The first thing that popped into my head is that there was like at some point in like 1993 or 4, Coca-Cola tried developing a soda just for Gen Xers.
Was that Coke? Was that the clear Coke?
I think it was called like Nothing or something, but like they got like alternative cartoonists to draw like faces for the can, so it was like Seth and Daniel Close drawing on it.
Damn.
And like of course it was like a total bomb and is now just a collector's item, but somehow it was like a micro, a like brief cultural moment, and then like someone tries to capitalize it on it.
Totally. And then it's just like, nope. Like once the money comes in, it's like the souffle deflates.
Right.
And I will say that, like, I think that from an Alex Inc. perspective, like that show, that adaptation of Startup to Alex Inc. was really sort of the beginning of the podcast to especially TV pipeline. Like that was really, really hot and may continue to be hot, so to speak, depending on various things in streaming history, but it kind of like or streaming upcoming, future, but like the podcast to TV pipeline coincided. Again, timing was really good with to going back to Gimlet launching when Serial was finishing its run, and then Alex Inc. launching right when kind of the streaming wars were beginning. Like there suddenly, and I talk about this in one of the episodes of the show, there were all these development execs at various streaming companies that were aware of podcasts, and everything was getting optioned. And very few things were getting made, which is part of the reason why Alex Inc. becoming a network television show was so remarkable. But so many things were getting optioned that it became, from within these podcast companies, like a very clear business sort of argument that like, oh, of course, we'll just do what Gimlet's doing and dump a ton of money into stuff, and then it'll become a TV show, which of course ignores the fact that like, first of all, something has to be like good as a podcast first, like if you're a podcast company, in my opinion, but then also, which is very controversial, I know, and kind of is and has been for me in my career in the past, but I will put that to the side. But also, like, in order for something to go from getting that $15,000 option fee or whatever to becoming, a limited run series or a network series, it just requires so many things to break in the right way. And I think as a result, it led to, even with this period of time, I'd say in like, what would that be, like 2018 to potentially present, with all of these streamers coming online, like where in theory, like more things were getting optioned and picked up than ever because there's this greater demand for content. So it's just another example of Gimlet being like right place, right time, so there's, and just to kind of, because I like must make myself understand things, as Joan Didion said, and I'm going to butcher this, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. I tell myself stories about how I experienced the podcast industry in order to live. That gets back to like the initial inflection point, Serial, then Gimlet starting, then Alex Inc. and people being like, oh, podcast company now, TV company now, then Gimlet selling to Spotify in, I believe that was 2019. And I remember when that happened, how big of a deal it was. And it just being like, because they were sold for, I believe it was the price tag was for, they were acquired for $250 million, which was unheard of, and actually was just the beginning of a series of big deals for original production companies and all of their original IP and the tech stack that started around that time.
Mhm.
And I can remember like at that time I was I just started a company with the other co-founder of Planet Money and he was somewhere else, and I saw this Gimlet news and I was just like, fuck it, I'm going home. Like there was just something about it where I was just like, this is not going to be good for me. I don't know why, but this is not going to be good for me. In part because I was deeply jealous, like so deeply jealous of my, like in a lot of senses, good friends who just made a lot of money. But also there was just this sense of me of like things have changed, and have I positioned myself to change with the times?
Mhm. So there have been a number of shows now, not Alex Inc., where it's like a sitcom based on the, foibles of a podcast startup, but like stories that are, it's usually a limited series. A lot are in true crime or an investigation, and then they've been dramatized in limited run series. So those include Dirty John, Dr. Death, The Dropout, the one about the blood testing,
Theranos, yep.
Shrink Next Door. So some of these things that started as podcasts have become major, a lot are on streaming, TV productions with major stars and Emmy nominations and stuff like that. So some people have like hit the jackpot through this, but it seems sort of crazy to think like I'm going to make a podcast like so that there's a 1 in 10,000 chance that it'll become a TV show, because it just seems like so
Right.
unlikely, because there's so many, as you talk about this in the episode, there's so many ways that any TV show could just fall apart and not happen. And that even when it does happen, it could get canceled after one season.
Totally.
It is, it's a total flop. So, so that seems strange to me. I mean, it seems sort of like the venture capital model of, investing in 1,000 different tech startups, thinking that one of them will become $1 billion, company, or like what do they call it? Like a whale or
A unicorn.
unicorn. Yes. And, if you have $1 billion to invest, then you could do that and give $5 million to 1,000 different companies and, turn a profit. But doing it like expecting that Hollywood is going to give you a big payday in the end seems sort of crazy to me. But I guess it has worked out, at least for some podcasts, because,
Yeah.
the Elizabeth Holmes story is, was a hit or whatever for Hulu.
But I think it also there's like a certain amount of hubris to think that I saw this like in the podcast, when I was working at different podcast companies where, like what I say in the streaming episode of my show, like there's like nothing particularly new in any of that. And I know that the people that I worked with in the past, especially people who had come from film and TV, knew that the odds were bad, but there was a certain kind of, I think, hubris of, well, we're making the good content, so it'll definitely work out for us. And look at these other guys, see Gimlet, who are doing it. But I think also there's this, you mentioned, VCs who are making these investments. There's a certain kind of value created by a show, by a podcast that becomes a television show, that even say it's on streaming, it has one season, one short season. If there is a billboard on Sunset Boulevard that someone can take a picture of and send to the investors as part of the story of the way that the company is scaling, in a lot of cases, that's worth more than whatever financial success the company would actually get from the show itself.
So
So
you
it
prove
becomes
that
this,
prove that you
yeah,
did it once,
you
then
can
you
do it
could
again, and
possibly
here's
do it again.
another X amount of money, right? And I know that's cynical, but I know that that's the case. I mean, it's all, business is all about storytelling too, cliche alert. But I think that as far as it relates to, podcasts becoming, especially television shows in the last few years, the wins are less about, oh, we're not the, the podcast companies didn't necessarily have the leverage to fight to make the kind of money that they would need to make and get the kind of EP credits and long-term participation in these streaming deals that they were making. I saw things being kind of pushed to just happen at a bunch of different companies, like regardless of the terms, just so that they could point to that billboard if the show got made, so they could raise more money. Which is fascinating to me. And like, I don't blame them, I guess. Like, I don't know. I haven't run my own podcast. I haven't run a venture-backed podcast company for my, little shameless nation. I don't have the stomach for that, but maybe that's why I'm not rich,
Right. And so the shamelessness, this comes into play, and you have an
Yeah.
episode where you talk about Shark Tank or the Canadian version of Shark Tank, Dragon's Den, and that sort of, entrepreneurial personality type who is, willing to, like, has an idea that they think could be a big success, and is like what it takes to
Yeah.
sell that type of thing. So something I was thinking about while listening to the show is, when I talk to people in, regular people who do not host a podcast, about podcasting, I've been saying recently that it seems to me like we're still in the very early days of the medium, like television in like the 40s or 50s. And who knows where this thing could go.
From your mouth to Pod's ears. I agree.
Okay, but listening to your show, it sort of seems like, well, maybe our best days are behind us, or it took this wrong turn such that it's like there was sort of a .com, like equivalent to the .com bubble, and then sort of a bursting is happening now as streamers, cut their costs and things don't pan out exactly as they should be. So where do you think the podcast industry medium is? Is there a historical parallel that you think we're somewhere in the middle of right now?
Yeah. That caveat is I am not a media theorist. I could become one, I guess. But
I think anyone could do it these days.
Anyone can do it. So I'm setting up my shingle, Laura Mayer, media theory. I think I've said this to some other folks, and I think I may have said this in the podcast, but like, I am still incredibly bullish on podcasting as a creative form, both on the narrative side and then also just, on the chat side. And I think that the fact that I'm differentiating between narrative and chat so clearly is like part of why the medium may feel stuck for listeners at this stage. Like, I think that in a lot of cases, like, there's still a lot of play to be done within the kind of shows that are being greenlit that can be both story driven and personality driven, which I think is the distinction between narrative and chat respectively. I do think that there is a business correction at hand. I think that that's the case for basically, every industry right now, but especially media or anything that's kind of been frothy with maybe extra special investment interest over the last few years, just as we are entering hard times or harder times or whatever times. I am of the opinion that, so I will say that in 2009, I mentioned this earlier, like when I started at WNYC, like, I think I mentioned this, they were shutting down a lot of the podcasts, and there was always talk there and then among friends of mine about, oh, the podcast bubble is bursting. And then since then, like, there's every 3 months, there is the group chats are just like, well, here's the podcast bubble bursting, especially people who have been around it, for, or at least this iteration of it, for the period of time that I have. And the truth is, the bursting that happened in 2009 obviously was tied to the Great Recession, and there not being, I think, a really like fully thought through and hungry advertising space for podcasts that had the chance to be proven. Once the economy started. Once the economy started recovering from the Great Recession, of course, that changed. Investment from media companies became more interested in trying to teach folks how to sell podcasting. Suddenly podcasts were being made again, yada, 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 serial, etc. What I do think will happen is I think that a lot of the kind of maybe less stable, both from a creative and then also from a real audience listenership and revenue perspective, players are going to start shaking out of the market because there's not going to be that attempt to be able to, not that ability to go back to the investment well and kind of patch up holes if a creative or business plan isn't fully solid. So I do think that podcasting is experiencing a correction. I think that we're going to be looking at shows that are made at lower costs. But I think that the difference between now and 2008, 2009, when there was really the thought of the bubble having burst, is that people have developed the habit of listening to podcasts way more than they had then.
Right.
The technology is different. Like
I mean,
cars,
in 2009, the iPhone had been out for,
like a
you
year,
know, yeah,
2
two
years,
years or so.
2007.
I
Yeah.
didn't get a smartphone until 2012, I think.
Yeah.
And when I was the first podcast I listened to, I would listen to them on my laptop.
Right. Me too.
Yeah, so that there's still people who do that, but it's now very closely associated with the smartphone, and everyone has a smartphone now. So yeah, the technology
Right.
has changed a lot.
And not to mention, and there's smartphones and there's also like smart cars. And so I do think that like the days of the kind of cliche, like I do think that there was a sense at a certain point when revenue was going up, 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 and listener numbers were going up, 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 just month over month. Every time I was part of, an all hands sales meeting for a couple of years at various companies, like that time is over for now, or at least maybe stopping. But I think that it's been sort of a long time coming for the rule book to be rewritten a little bit. Like I think that what the danger of sort of things being sort of at status quo for so long is that a lot of players, a lot of people who have made podcasts have sort of been doing the same things over and over again. And with adversity, you're sort of forced into change. And so I think from an artistic perspective and from a business perspective, that's going to mean that, as whatever version of whatever you want to call it, the bubble popping, the bubble slightly deflating, the course correcting happens, we're going to emerge on the other side with a whole new host of creators and types of content that make more sense for where podcasting is today.
Mhm. So so one reason I think like I'm optimistic about the future podcasting is it continues to be okay. Anyone can do it, even me, and I
Mhm.
don't know what I'm doing.
Oh, you know what
And
you're doing.
but truly, like, I mean, if you compare it to making your own TV show or um making your own movie or even like making your own music and distributing it online, it's a lot easier to do it. And it is so in some ways it's like a totally open system. It's somewhat akin to blogging. Like you just need a couple
Mhm.
basic skills and you can do something like that is listenable. And so anyone can do it more or less, and you don't need you can spend a lot of money to build a home studio or
Mhm.
get the best equipment, but you can also do it on the cheap.
Mhm.
And certainly compared to making an independent film or something, it's much easier. um
Totally.
but one of the problems is, um if you make something, how does anyone find it? And
Right.
this is a nut that if no one has exactly cracked yet. The Apple, formerly, iTunes, Apple Podcast app interface, has mysterious ways and seems
Mm-hmm.
to, if it recommends you or something, or if you can move up that, there'll be like a snowball effect.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but most of the stuff that is on there comes from either an established personality, an established brand, a famous, like a celebrity, or like this is the new thing from the New York Times or the
Right.
new thing from Bloomberg or whatever. But there's stuff that bubbles up that, is just some people doing their own weird thing and you can hear it. So it's, sort of equivalent to blogging. And of course, blogging basically died for various reasons, social media.
Mm-hmm.
And but like there was like a period of acquisitions
Right.
where people like Andrew Sullivan or
Mm.
Matt Iglesias or Ezra Klein or
Mm-hmm.
something, who started off just doing it themselves, like got picked up by a larger
Mm-hmm.
media outlet. Yeah, so it still seems like early early days to me, and the financials are still hard to figure out.
Right.
But the basic technology is so open that it makes me think, you know, this is not like this is not going to be like blogs. Like
Right.
innovation is going to continue. Whether people can make a living doing this is different, and that was also very hard
Totally.
in the blog era. But like people who want to make interesting creative projects, like they can continue doing that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think so. I'm betting my life professionally on it. So, yes, I think so. I mean, I think that and also like in different iterations of my professional life, like I've been in this position of having to just go out and make as many shows as possible. And I think that that was bad for everybody involved. Um, Listeners, the people making them, myself, my cats, etc. Um, and I think that one positive and that was just purely to capture the in during that period of time a few years ago, like there was just not enough um there was too much demand from an advertising standpoint and not enough um inventory on the podcast side, when working with a big publisher. And it was almost like the audience numbers at that time, because things were different, were less relevant than just getting ads in ad slots.
Mhm.
Now, I don't know how effective any of those ads were. I know that I was involved with making a lot of very bad podcasts as a result of that. And so like, and and it wasn't just like, oh, someone made me, like, I know I've made bad decisions, because if you're tasked with making like a ton of stuff, you're going to make a bunch of stuff that probably sounds a ton of stuff without a lot of resources. You're going to make a
Right.
ton of stuff that doesn't sound good. Um, and so, I think that ideally there's the shows that there will be discovery mechanisms outside of just the big apps kind of putting something in the right spot where if you open your phone, it's just easy to click on. I don't know how we'll get there. No one has cracked that discovery nut. But then there's also like, I don't know if you saw the news from Defector Media, which is kind of reader owned. And they have this podcast called
Writer owned.
Writer Owned.
So the
Duh.
Defector is the people
Sorry.
who all quit Deadspin and
Yes, yes,
started their
yes.
own sports and culture website.
Yeah, that was a bad misspeaking. Although I'm assuming if it's writer owned, it's also they can also read, so it would be readers as well.
Well, let's not get it. I don't know how much time you spent on Twitter. There was a controversy a couple months ago about expecting someone who's a writer to read books, whether that
Oh, really?
is bad or not. Yeah, we don't need to get into
Well,
that. There were
yeah,
charges that it was ableist to expect a writer to read books because not everyone can read quickly, and
interesting.
it's hard for some people to read, and you shouldn't, saying
Okay.
you can't be a writer because you can't read a book, that's not good. So that was an interesting Twitter kerfuffle from a couple of months ago.
I will
But
Google that.
I'll fill you in afterwards on the,
Yes,
on the
please
details.
do. But what was interesting is Defector announced that one of their podcast, Normal Gossip, which if you haven't heard, is
I've heard of it and it sounds
oh
super interesting. It's like on my list of things to check out.
move it to number 1 because you will have fun. It is so much fun to listen to. It is exactly what it sounds like. It's a show in which the host, Kelsey, and her producer go through listener submitted or audience, or if they have someone on the show kind of going through the details of just what it sounds like, normal gossip that they've encountered. Which it's so good. And the reason why I like this,
So it's not gossip about celebrities. It's like
no,
this is the gossip from people's lives, anonymized, I assume.
yeah,
And
totally anonymized, or it's a gossip from someone else that's close to the person. Like it's the stakes are so low, and yet because gossip is so fun, it is incredibly energetic to listen to. It is the most I have the most fun listening to podcasts when I listen to this show. And like it's inspired me. It makes me feel like I will stop gushing about it in a moment, but like there's something about the show too that like makes me feel like Harriet the Spy a little bit because it's sort of like there could be gossip sitting around any corner. But anyway, they Defector put out this report and mentioned normal gossip, and it's totally true that like they took a bet on that the show would do well. They took a bet on making a show that was replicable, meaning that their production schedule wasn't one in which they needed to produce 50 episodes a year in order to hit this specific way that ads are being sold right now to break even. They determined that they took a risk on the show because they knew that they had a sense that there would be an audience there. They knew that Defector could help promote that, but that beyond that audience, there would be a snowball effect where others would find that show, and they did. And rarely is a show so routinely in the Apple Podcast top 100 without having like you mentioned, like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, like
Mhm.
or X celebrity with a certain kind of megaphone behind them, like a television show. Like they are consistently in the top 200. I think they revealed, I could be wrong, that the show is getting 250,000 listeners, I believe, per episode, or that might be monthly. Either way, that's sick. Those are some sick numbers. And the show is making money, and it's making money without causing everybody who's involved with it to be like, we can't like to like kind of have that finals in high school or college era push, and then like be like, we can't make any more of the show for an extended period of time until our like immune system resets. And I do think that in a lot of ways, and the show is fun. Like there's nothing about like it's like I look forward to it. I know a lot of people who listen to it really look forward to it. And to me, from a creative standpoint, like I'm hoping that my show, Shameless Acquisition Target, despite the fact that it's like so specific to the podcast industry, is fun to listen to.
It is.
And
I've enjoyed listening to it.
oh, thank you. But like but I also think that like there is a lesson I'm trying to kind of separately work on that I know that Normal Gossip has really done, which is that I had a feeling there would be an audience for the show. There is an audience for the show, certainly more niche than their, 250,000 per episode. I would be currently raising cats in my cat farm right now if that were the case. But because of the way that I sort of run my P&L for the show, I can keep making it if I wanted to. Or if I was able to, if I get my money right, et cetera. Listen to the last episode, November 30th. And I think that those are decisions that kind of independents can make much easier than than networks can, because networks are always going to be searching for volume. So maybe this is the beginning of a new era of independent creators.
Okay, well that's optimistic. Yeah, I just downloaded the first episode as we were talking.
It's fun.
Multiple people have recommended this show to me, and then it's strangely, and as I mean, I wanted to spend at least a little bit of time getting some advice from a podcast insider. It does seem like word of mouth is an effective thing in the world of podcasts, or at least I've been led to believe that. And then various podcasts I listen to will say, of course, they all say rate and review, but they also say like tell a friend. It seems like there's something about podcasting that is so personal because you're almost always listening to it using things that are stuck in your ears, hearing a voice like being beamed right into your brain, usually by yourself. And you start to feel like you sort of know these people, especially if it's like a chat show that has recurring guests or recurring hosts,
Yeah,
then
they're your pals.
yes, so there's a sort of what parasocial relationship, I guess is the term,
Mhm.
um, with that. But so, personal recommendations apparently are quite effective in spreading a podcast around. And so multiple people have mentioned this one to me now. Do you, what do you make of that? And how does one make their podcast audience grow
Yeah.
without juking the stats or
Yes.
I don't know about you. I'm on LinkedIn, and about 5 times a week I get someone from Bangladesh saying they're a podcast promoter
Yes, me
wanting to connect
too.
with me.
You
I've
mean
looked at
all of our mutual friends?
I've looked into this a little bit. Apparently it's various scams where like people have a
Oh, yeah,
thousand, Apple accounts and are sign in and out every 10 seconds to download episodes and stuff like that. So it's like paying someone on Fiverr to, you know, reload your homepage over and over again
totally.
or something. But yeah, do you think word of mouth is an actual
Yeah,
way to spread the word?
100%. I mean, it's definitely not the magic bullet that everyone wants to hear when, they have the question of like, how do you build your podcast audience? Word of mouth still works. The easiest way to find a listener is by it's as if they hear about your podcast on another show. I think newsletters are a really good way to promote your show. I've seen with my show right now, and then other shows I've worked on, that being a pretty good way to drive listenership, especially if it's a newsletter that has an audience that you think would probably listen to your show or would like to hear about your show. Getting the placement on the various apps, is good, but I think that there's a diminishing return because, increasingly with more, there's some gatekeeping involved, and then because you need to know the right people who are running those editorial curation at the time. And if you don't, then no dice. And then even more so, now that there are more shows, being promoted, you no longer get your like 3 days in the sun. You get like 1 day maybe. And it's like, then you don't really get to
Hmm.
have that sort of snowball effect. I'm curious to see, there's this phenomenon that I'm sure you know about called book talk, which is like, TikTok about books.
Hmm.
I've heard in podcasting just like so much interest around how like lessons can be learned from book talk, how podcasts can be promoted on TikTok. I'm sure that's a thing. I'm like too old and tired to figure that out, but that's probably
Yes.
something.
On the show, you mentioned that you
Oh
hired
my
some
gosh.
millennial,
No, they're Gen
marketing.
Z.
I'm
They
sorry,
would
Gen
be
Z
they would be so
marketers.
offended if
Yeah,
if
apologies,
they
Gen
knew.
Zers. I'm sure they think I'm cringe and chuggy.
I am cringe. They keep saying I'm cringe.
But they're urging you to get on TikTok and to do,
Yes.
yeah. So I mean, like that. TikTok's the algorithm somehow, finds things that the viewer, or the user of the app wants, and is mysterious in a way that the Apple podcast recommendation algorithm is as well. But I guess because of the size of the app, like things
Yeah.
can really like snowball there in a way they don't on Twitter anymore or
Yeah.
never did.
Yeah. There's something about like churn, like, and there can be things that in a good way, and you can have TikTok posts that like will just randomly go viral as opposed to needing some kind of extra bump from a influencer. I am in so much TikTok, not financial, but video debt to my youths. I paid them the last of the money, so I that has not helped me feel better. But I am starting to make TikTok videos now, so I'll let you know if I find any sort of secret weapons.
Yeah, is there a pod talk, which I guess is a hard thing to say because it sounds like you're
Pod
saying talk instead of
talk.
talk, but
I don't
book talk, you know.
I don't know. I think that people are trying, but I don't know if it's happened. And
Right.
apologies to your listeners if it has happened and I just don't know because I've been too busy sending emails trying to get people to give me money.
Okay, well let's talk a little bit more about that.
Hmm.
Um Something that your show does that I've never heard a podcast do before is you talk explicitly about money coming in and money going out
Hmm.
and how much you're charging your advertiser slash sponsor to highlight the company or what service that they're promoting. And so in your first episode, you said you had someone who was paying you $1,000
Mhm.
to do advertisement, or however you would describe it. And then you're saying next week, anyone who has at least 1,001,
Mhm.
you can take this slot. And then you're also at the end of each episode talking about how much you're saying your profit and loss statement explicitly, how much you've spent on the show and how much you've made. So this is interesting, both because usually that sort of stuff is not talked about publicly, but also like, yeah, what does it, no one ever talks about how much it actually costs to make a podcast or, any of the behind the scenes stuff. So can you talk about like why you decided to be transparent about that and how
Yeah.
that this whole thing has worked so far?
Well, so the transparency was based on the fact that, um, I'm just trying to be as open about the process as possible. And also, like, a kind of a guiding light for the project has been like, there's a lot of like jokiness, but to the extent that anyone's the butt of the joke, it's got to be me. Like, I don't want anyone to feel like they're being made fun of. And I think part of that sort of spirit was behind this idea of being like, look at me, I'm a dummy for spending X amount of money on this thing you just listened to. And also getting to the point of like, I like, this is all my savings from like being just aggressively cheap over the years. Like, I no longer have the capacity to self-fund something like this.
Mhm.
And so I figured, might as well throw all of my various thoughts at it. And one of them is, I think there needs to be some transparency around how much it costs to make a show. That said, by like narrative podcast standards, I'm making the show a lot cheaper than I think a lot of other companies would. And I've gotten some response for that, like, stop blowing up our spot kind of thing.
Oh, I
um
didn't even think about that. Interesting.
but then at the same time, like, those have been sort of few and far between because like it is such a specific show. Obviously writing the whole thing and reporting it to the extent that there is reporting. So like, and I'm not paying myself. So yeah, that's like gonna be, that's not part of the calculus. In terms of the ads, like, frankly, I'm a little on the fence on how I feel about dynamic ad insertion in podcasts because, in looking back at how things kind of went down with especially like the fall of CPMs in with websites and stuff, like a lot of that was driven by selling, and someone knows this who's listening, so many people who know this who's listening know this better than me, but selling, show or selling advertisements in this kind of dynamically inserted way.
So can
And
you can you define that
yeah,
CPM? Is that clicks per thousand? Is that what that means?
per meal, so per thousand, which is
Yeah.
something I learned like a couple of years ago. So it's like CPM is like, a price of like, what would be the price for every 1,000 listeners to a show. And
And dynamically inserted
means,
means
so like, dynamically inserted is, so like in my show, for example, I don't do dynamically inserted ads. They're just ads that are baked into the content of the show, meaning they are within the podcast. They're not going to be removed from the podcast. And that was deliberate because I wanted to, first of all, make sure that the sponsors were getting the most bang for their buck. And then also in some cases, I wanted the opportunity to have the ads speak to the content of the show, because I always like that, frankly,
yes.
like when I'm listening to shows. And so
So it's not like on your show, it's not like, and now a word from our sponsor exactly, but you're sort of breaking in and doing these little vignettes or interviews woven into the narrative. But
mhm,
then on some other podcasts, if you listen to it the first week and if you listen to it 6 months later, possibly different ads have been inserted in. And then sometimes you
mhm,
catch this when they've been inserted in the wrong location,
yeah,
and it's like a minute early. So they don't go to break correctly. So
mhm.
that's when it's very obvious that like a human did not make this decision.
Yeah, or it's an ad that, like, even if it's put in the right spot, even if it's like, it's a fine thing to be advertised, like, the sound for the ad is, like, way louder than the body
Mm-hmm.
of the show, like, I don't know, like, I think that this is something that is hard to do at scale, but I'm a big believer in, if you're gonna be selling ads for something, like, make them fun to listen to, in
Mm-hmm.
addition to the rest of the content. And so, initially, like, frankly, I wasn't planning on selling ads for the series because I didn't want to overpromise listener numbers and underdeliver because I didn't
Mm-hmm.
know what the listener numbers were going to be. And I was going to initially in the ad slots do this thing that my twin brother and I talked about doing when we were little kids, but on podcasts, which was like write to celebrities and ask them for $1,000. And so each of my ad breaks was going to be like, "Hey, Mark Cuban, can I have $1,000?" Like it was going to be very Shark Tank forward.
Uh-huh.
And then I was interviewing Brian Barletta from Sounds Profitable, who will actually be back on the show to discuss his business and things because it's very relevant to my overall point of view on the industry. But we were doing that interview and I mentioned to him, like, yeah, I'm not going to sell ads. And he was like, what are you doing? Like, you have to sell ads. And he's the one who's like, listen, you got to sell it as a sponsorship if you're worried about the listener numbers. And you have to, and here's what I'll do: $1,000. Anyone else who can do more than that, knock me off. This is a challenge.
Okay, so
And so
that's the guy
that's
in the
how it
first
started.
episode.
Yep. So that's how in the first
Okay, that's interesting.
episode, it ended up kind of becoming this in public bidding war.
Right.
And so then I accidentally, and with the next advertiser or sponsor, sorry, bought a slot in the show for I believe it was $1,001 exactly. And then because people were like behind in listening to episode, and then I was like, okay, I'm setting the next ad at $2,000. But because people were behind at listening to the episodes, I got like inundated with emails of people being like, I'll do $1,003, $1,004, 1,000. I was just like, oh my God, like I can't keep track of this. And then in the third episode, I had to like rethink. I had to, stop the car and turn around and rethink what my ad strategy would be. And that's when I did like a series of cross promos, which kind of gets back to your point earlier, which is like you find out about a podcast from other podcasts. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah. And I also wanted to be honest about the profit and loss statement, because if someone does buy me, I want to make or buy the show, buy the feed, buy, whatever, hire me as an employee at their company to make the show. I want to be clear, like how much I kind of put on the table of myself in order to try and make that happen. And I think that there's less satisfaction in that if people aren't brought along on the journey as well. As opposed to just me being like, oh, by the way, I spent $22,000 on this show and someone gave me 40,000. So math
Mm-hmm.
says I made $18,000. Bye. Like that would be kind of a bummer ending of the
Mm-hmm.
season. I mean, it'd be cool to make money, but I just mean from a narrative perspective.
Right. And we're recording this in between the time when the fifth episode aired and you're working on the finale, I think.
hmm
And the
hmm
finale going to reveal if
What
anyone
has
did
happened to me?
acquire you or the show or the RSS feed or the intellectual property rights.
hmm
Okay, so one thing I did want to ask about is okay, you can make money through advertising, you can make money by being acquired by a larger company, and you can make money hoping that your show will be turned into a movie or TV show or something like that. One of the few other models is like a Patreon model
hmm
where people are subscribing to you directly and they usually get some sort of bonus like an extra episode a week or
hmm
something like that. And this is basically the same as the Substack model. This it seems like this is a sturdier model than relying on ads or relying on the whims of executives at large corporations. What do you think of this? Did you think about employing some version of this
hmm
in your show? Do you think this is promising or is it just a fad as well?
I don't think it's a fad. I think it's super promising. Um, Especially considering the real loyalty and therefore feeling of ownership that a lot of listeners have for their favorite shows. The only thing that has really been stopping me, and this might not continue to be the case, who knows, with whatever I decide to do slash what will happen to me, which I guess is the tagline for the last episode, is if I were to do Patreon, I would want to make sure that I was really, really offering something that people would want and being able to deliver on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, with this, we deliberately, like in creating the show by myself, like I was like, okay, well, there's the sponsors, but I'm not, tied to some kind of network's clock. So I can kind of put things out as I need to, if I need extra time, if I'm, also I have a bunch of other clients doing other work. So like sometimes life gets in the way / life is money. And so if I were to do the Patreon thing, meaning the Patreon, sort of business model, which is a good one. Like I am someone who I think primarily listens to Patreon bonus episodes after a certain point in the week. I definitely subscribe to many shows' Patreon feeds. I would need to, for myself, like really make sure that I would be able to keep up the output, because I don't want people to pay me and then not give them what they expect.
Right.
And so I think that if I were to go that route or some combination of that route, I would probably do it for free, meaning outside of the Patreon paywall, bonus episodes for a period of time, see what that's like. And then once I get a sense of what the actual production process would look like for me, with the mix of my other work, that's when I think I would feel comfortable, if I got to that point, to be able to do Patreon in a real wholehearted way.
Yeah. I mean, it seems, one other thing I've thought about podcasts with ads is it's easier to skip ads in podcasts than it is in most other mediums, because you can fast forward 30 seconds. And then if you listen to a lot of podcasts, you hear a lot of the same ads if they're not doing like a native read or doing some interesting spin on it. And how many times do I want to hear a BetterHelp ad? So I'll just skip ahead. So I wonder if advertisers have realized that yet. And and the Patreon model, you don't have to deal with that that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't know. Like, we'll see what ends up happening to me in the end with my podcast. But it's just, I kind of want to, I think I'm just, because I don't need to think of things at scale, I do any opportunity that I can like focus on the content being good and feel like solid in that I'm giving people something that's worth something. The more bespoke, and knowing that'll require a more like bespoke strategy, that's where I'm going to go for now. Unless something happens between now and November 30th, which will be the last episode of the season / series ? That causes me to totally sell out and change my mind.
Okay. And, you talk a lot on the show about why you need to make money and want to make money. And some of it comes from your childhood background and having an infant yourself and wanting the safety of homeownership and other things like that. So, people should tune in. Shameless Acquisition Target, and links will be in the show notes to this. And if people want to follow you on Twitter, what's your Twitter handle?
It is LRMAYER, LR Mayer at Twitter. And then also, if you go to shameless.biz, it has all of the various listening links at the top. So that might save you from what I call, you can't avoid three things: death, taxes, and show notes. So you can just put shameless.biz in the show notes and people will be able to listen to it there.
Right. And you are selling merch. That's another.
Oh, yes. Every week, every episode, new merch.
Another revenue thing that you're sort of doing, it's a full spectrum
360
on this problem of how can an independent producer or creative person make a living in podcasts. So people, yeah, so people can buy t-shirts and mugs and stuff like that. Yeah, okay. Well, I've enjoyed the show so far. I'm
Thank you
looking
so much.
forward to the finale and hope it's a happy ending, of course. So thank you, Laura, for coming on. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
No, thank you for having me. This has been fun.
Well, thank you again. Thank you to all the listeners out there. Listeners, you can tell your friends if you have any about this show if you want if you want this show to thrive in the future and rate, review, and all those other things. I don't have any merch yet. Maybe I should.
Yeah, make some merch. It's very easy. tpublic.com. They're not paying me yet.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Thank you, listeners. We'll see you again next time.
Thank you. Bye.